Okay, good evening. Welcome everyone to the next in our Christianity in a Hot Seat series. My name is Lenny and I am here tonight to talk to you about a big issue that we're going to have dealing with tonight, which is why does God allow suffering and evil in the world? That's quite the topic and something that I think a lot of people have asked about, wondered about. You know, we're in a time of a pandemic right now, right? And a lot of people are thinking about, wow, what do we do in all this? Why is this even happening? There's a lot of questions that have come along. So I think this is a great question. It's usually one of the biggest issues that I face when people are asking about, questions of God and does Christianity make sense and things like that. But before we jump in too far, I did want to give you some interesting little tidbits like I did last week. But these are fascinating things because what I found is that people tend to be willing to blame everyone but themselves when something goes wrong. If we're talking about problems in our lives, a lot of times we don't want to take responsibility for it. There are certain, for example, insurance claims that have been filed, and I was able to see a few of these, and people were actually writing on some of their statements, when they asked, how did your vehicle get damaged or something to that effect. These were the reasons that they offered. And so one of them said, coming home, I drove into the wrong house and collided with a tree I don't have, which is interesting. Yes, I would imagine that's to be true. Or a person said, I collided with a stationary truck coming the other way. You see, there's just a little bit of a equivocation going on, a little bit of just a nuance that they want to make sure that it's not necessarily all their fault. Or I like this one. The person writes, the guy was all over the road. I had to swerve a couple of times before I hit him. Yeah. Or to avoid hitting the bumper of the car in front, I struck a pedestrian, which is probably not a good exchange, not a good way to go. Okay. I pulled away from the side of the road, glanced at my mother-in-law, and headed over the embankment. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That can't be that bad. Or this person, I thought my window was down, but I found it was up when I put my head through it. Yeah, that'll do it. I was on the way to the doctor with rear end trouble when my universal joint gave way, causing me to have an accident. That just sounds like a mess I don't want to deal with. Or lastly, the telephone pole was approaching. I was attempting to swerve out of the way when I struck the front end. Yeah, poor telephone poles get in our ways quite a bit. Now, these are, of course, silly examples. I recognize that. But there are other issues that we deal with that we don't have as much control over. How do we understand those in the light of a God of love? Why would he even allow evil? Isn't God big enough to stop the evil that we see? Well, that's a good question. And these questions really aren't new. They've been covered as long as people have been around because people have suffered. And that's part of the issue. Even David, the man after God's own heart, worried about this. And he, in Psalm 5, he says very clearly that he was thinking about these things. And let me see if I can pull it up here. So David says right here, listen to my words, Lord. Consider my sighing. Pay attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God. For I pray for you. In the morning, Lord, you hear my voice. In the morning, I plead my case to you and watch expectantly. Now, why is he pleading? Because he's hurting. He says, for you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil cannot dwell with you. The boastful cannot stand in your sight. You hate all evildoers. You destroy those who tell lies. The Lord abhors violent and treacherous people. Well, that's kind of part of the question. If the Lord abhors violent and treacherous people, then Why does evil exist? Why does he allow it to continue? And that's the topic we're going to discuss today. So, in talking about this, we're going to deal with two aspects of the problem of evil. And it's important to understand that there is a way that we can divide this up. We need to understand why we must suffer. Why is this, or why must we suffer, I should say? Why is this issue, right? There's a conflict of asking why we must endure pain in our own lives, even in our own bodies, especially when we've been faithful to Jesus. For example, have you ever felt something that I call the Job cascade? Now, what is the Job cascade? Well, let me explain this to you. Like the prophet or Old Testament character of Job, Job was doing nothing wrong. And he got a lot of bad news really quickly, right? And after all this disaster comes to his life, just spins him, turns him upside down. He prays and he seeks God and he says, should we not accept evil from God if we accept his blessings as well, right? Can't we take the tough times with the good times? And after Job prays, it seems like things got worse, not better. Have you ever felt that in your life? I think a lot of people have felt that, where they assume that God is because God is a loving God, they assume that, he'll take care of them and he won't let terrible things happen. We'll be blessed. We'll always live a blessed life. Blessed life means no to hardship. That's what a lot of people think blessed means, and it doesn't. So they're going along just fine. They haven't really given much thought to who God is or why he, does the things he does. And then they have some difficulty in their life. And they think, well, I'm a, believer. I'll go ahead and pray and I'll get over it. And then it gets worse. This happened to me, even in my own life. My wife was expecting our third child, and we were very excited about it. We thought it was going to be a great blessing, and definitely it was. But there's always this anticipation, before a child is born. Always an excitement, new life coming into the world, all that kind of thing. And she wakes me up at early in the morning, I don't know, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, whatever it is, saying that she has pains in her back, labor pains, let's go. Oh, okay. So we get everything together. We had it all prepared, drive down to the doctor's hospital there. And we'd called the doctor, and the nurse comes in, checks us out. And immediately things changed, because what we found out was she wasn't having labor pains. Her back was hurting because her liver was shutting down. She was in a crisis situation known as HELP, hemolysis, enlarged liver and low platelets. Basically, she was really at death's door. She had 75% of her blood was more or less just water, not doing anything. Her blood pressure was about 200 over 120. She was in a life or death crisis situation. And I remember as they said, we have to remove the baby. We got to take him out right away. Minute 37 seconds, they did a C-section. That's the only way to reverse this. The other option is death. It's like, oh my gosh. So I'm sitting there, and they're working on my wife, and they've taken the child, and he's teeny tiny. He's 3 pounds, 15 ounces. And I'm in what would have been the labor delivery room, but all the lights are off because they had to take her straight to the OR. And I'm just praying, and I'm going, what just happened? What just happened? Right? How did this happen? I remember praying to God saying, I don't even understand what's going on right now. And the thoughts came to me even at that point. Wow, well, is God real? I mean, I've prayed, I've done all the right things, quote unquote, and this stuff still happens. Is God hearing my prayers? Or maybe the atheists are right and my prayers are just reaching as high as the ceiling. Many people do this. Many people, when they hit a crisis point, that's when they start to get serious about what they believe and start asking the tough questions. Can I tell you that that's the wrong time to be asking those questions? You're too emotionally fraught and frail. You can't really think through these big questions at the time of emotional crisis. That's hard to do. I remember myself as I was praying that, I remember saying, I can't doubt God's existence because I've studied it. I've looked into it. And I know, I've read the best arguments from atheists, and I know that they fail. I can't doubt that Jesus rose from the dead because I've looked into it. I've searched out the best guys who don't believe that, and I found their arguments to be wanting. So God, I don't know what you're doing, but whatever it is you're doing, I trust you. And that's the key. That's why we have these classes. That's why we do these things, so that you can think through these issues now before you hit the Job cascade, before you hit this point of suffering. But why does God allow us to suffer? Beyond that, the question is, why does God allow suffering at all, right? What about the innocents? What about the children? What about folks like young kids? What about natural disasters? How do we deal with those kinds of questions? And the third and most important aspect on this is the fact that we need to get this right. The number of people who dismiss God, and many of whom dismiss God because of this issue, is growing, right? Nuns that you hear about who don't affiliate with any specific faith. Why are they not having faith? Why don't they hold to Christianity? Because they've never understood or learned about this aspect of who God is and how God works. And atheists have used this as a wedge. And that's the key in all of this. So as we continue in our discussion tonight, we're going to deal with the problem of evil. And one of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to talk about the kinds of evil that there are, because there's really, the question isn't a single question. There are multiple issues that are involved in it. So what do I mean by types of evil? Most evil is of a certain kind. It is man's inhumanity from man. So most of the time the evil is us. And let me give you this quote from a skeptic. This is an actual email that I received, and I'll see if I can pull it up full screen for you here. And this is what he writes out. He says to me, why does God allow evil? I've been trying to figure out why God created the hurricanes that devastated the Gulf Coast, the tsunami in Asia, and allowed the devastation that occurred in New York in his name on 9/11. Why did God murder all those innocent people? What could have gotten him so ticked off to commit genocide? Has he been talking to Hitler or Idi Amin again? I do not believe in God, but I do believe man has the potential to be God-like in his kindness and generosity, he writes. After all, God was created in man's image. Perhaps that is why God is evil. Okay, now there's a lot of issues going on with this letter right here, as you can see. Aside from the contradiction of, man has the potential to be God-like in his kindness and generosity, but God is a reflection of man, and that's why he's evil. I'm not sure how that is reconciled. He lays down the basic question. So many skeptics and atheists I've met point to this specific argument as their justification for not believing in God. But as I said, one of the things that we want to understand is the idea that there are really evil is something different. And there are two kinds of evil that we want to talk about. So we're going to look at, first of all, what I call moral evil. Now, what is moral evil? Well, moral evil is really the actions that we do in order to foster evil. So moral evil is murder, rape, or any action whereby one person is harmed by the choices of another. So let's take an example. Let's take a guy like John Ladd, right? Imagine being a guy like John Ladd who lived in the first half of the 20th century. He grew up during the Depression, and struggle was common. Food wasn't available for many families. He grew up hungry. Now, I don't know if the boy read about wealthy sailing in luxury liners, but that was the big rage at the time. Queen Mary, and you had even the Titanic in 1912 and all these. But luxury liners were the ultimate symbol of wealth and comfort in those days. Perhaps he dreamed of what an experience it would be like. And interestingly, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, plunged the nation into war, and Ladd was conscripted into the war effort. In the early part of 1943, he, along with 900 other men, were to set sail on the cruise ship SS Dorchester. And here's the SS Dorchester. There you go. He was here to set on the SS Dorchester that had been converted from a luxury cruise ship to handle troop transport. They were traveling from Newfoundland across the icy North Atlantic to the American base in Greenland. Now, even given the aspect of the war, this would have been an amazingly unique experience for most young men, and Ladd among them, I'm sure, would have been pretty interested to see how this worked. I mean, I would imagine someone who's never today, flown in a plane across country would be excited to go on such a voyage, right? So, on February 3rd, though, 1943, during the Atlantic crossing, the Dorchester was attacked by a German U-boat. And of the 902 men on board the U.S. A.T. Dorchester, 672 of them died, 2/3, leaving 230 survivors. It's almost like God gave them, I should say, a little piece of, excitement, but then boom, they get this attack. Why would God allow that? Well, you see, this is part of the logical problem of evil. And the logical problem of evil really goes back a long, long ways. It goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, who used to talk about this kind of thing and think it through. And there's a very famous argument called the Epicurean problem. This is Epicurus, and this is what he asked. He said, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then why is there evil? If he is neither able and willing, then why even call him God? Of course, this is popularized more recently by the British skeptic David Hume. And this is how he lays it out. So basically, David Hume has said, and this has been picked up by skeptics like Richard Dawkins and others in the New Atheist movement who would hold to this view. And they say, number one, a good God would want to destroy evil. An all-powerful God would be able to destroy evil. However, evil is not destroyed. Therefore, such a good and all-powerful God cannot exist. So that's David Hume. This is the what we call the logical problem of evil. And what Hume and others are trying to show is that the idea of evil is incompatible with the idea of God, that the two can't coexist. An all good and all loving God is not logically compatible with evil. There seems to be a contradiction there, is what Hume would say. However, there really is a key to the argument. And the key to the argument in this instance is the idea that God is able to do everything. Now, we understand God's omnipotence, okay, that he is all powerful, but all powerful doesn't mean that God could do whatever he wants, no matter what. So, for example, God cannot make a square circle, right? Because a square circle makes no sense. Or he can't make a four-sided triangle. There's no such thing as a four-sided triangle. You can't make a married bachelor. Those are what you call illogical propositions. They make no sense even of themselves. There's other things that God cannot do. Cannot be all good and lie. God cannot lie. Why can't he lie? Because he wouldn't be all good if he lies. Lie is a defect, right? God cannot sin. Sinning is a defect. It's something that removes you from goodness. It's not a good thing in and of itself. God cannot learn. If God is all-knowing, there's no way for God to learn. So you see these kinds of ideas that are played out. There are certain aspects in logic that says just because God is omnipotent doesn't mean he can do the illogical. And that's the key to the argument. So let's go back to the Hume argument again. You know, a good God would want to destroy evil, and all-powerful God would be able to destroy evil. However, evil is not destroyed. What is missing there is a third premise. There may be other reasons that God has for him to allow evil for a certain period of time. Just as there are reasons a physical therapist has to allow his patients to suffer in their physical therapy for a certain period of time. Now, the man who really fleshed this out was a gentleman by the name of Professor of Philosophy called Alvin Plantinga, and this is known as the free will defense. Plantinga wrote a book called God, Freedom, and Evil, and you can see it here. And he did a great job in explaining the fact that if God valued, I should say, something such as love, wanted to create creatures who would love him, then, just like he can't create a four-angled triangle, creatures who love him would need to be able to express their love freely. And if creatures can express their love freely, they can express their sin freely as well. Now, let me give you an example in this. I want to talk about my dog Sparky. My dog Sparky, and I have him here, so I'll show him to you. Bring him up. See this? This is Sparky. When I was a little younger, and the kids were all younger, I was flying quite a bit, traveling, speaking in different parts of the country, traveling a couple times a month at least. And the kids came up to me and they said, "Dad, we want a dog." Man, I don't want a dog. I know what's going to happen if we get a dog. First of all, you're not going to feed the dog. I'm going to be the one feeding the dog. You're not going to clean up after the dog. I'm going to be the one cleaning up after the dog, right? And he's going to have to be housebroken and leave the little presents on the carpet and all the mess. And then puppies tend to chew things, and your slippers are gone, and there's just all this work and the yapping at night and the house breaking, and oh my gosh. And plus, when we go on vacation, what would we do with the dog, right? If I want to take everyone in the family with me on one of these trips, now what? So I don't want to. So what I did was I came home with Sparky. And I said, "Guys, this is the perfect dog. This is it. This is the perfect dog." And I had to say, look, I'll show you. And let me see if I can get a second angle here so you can see what Sparky does. Okay, so here's Sparky, right? And you turn on his little... Oh, and he missed. Try again, Sparky. He walks out of frame. Okay. Sparky's having trouble. All right, well, that's Sparky. And I said, look, this is the perfect dog. Isn't this great? Because he comes when you want him to come. He barks when you want him to bark. You can pet him. He's soft to the touch. He does tricks. You don't have to feed him. You don't find his little nuts and bolts on the carpet, right, that you have to sweep up. He's the perfect dog. Yeah, they all sat up and went like this. So we now have 2 dogs and a fish all of a sudden. But why didn't my boys accept my dog Sparky? What's the difference? Sparky does all the good things, none of the bad things. What's the difference? Sparky can't show volitional love. Sparky can't give of himself, just running a program. So God could create beings, if he desires, that would never sin. They would run on this program. But that's not true love. You can't force love at the edge of a gun. Love has to be given freely. And if you're going to be able to give love freely, then you must also be able to reject that. Loving is, again, doing what the other person values. And if you have the ability to love them, you can also have the ability to do what they don't value, which is sin. So you see, this is one of the things that we've found. And this is what Plea makes in his case on in God, Freedom, and Evil. That it's not God is all powerful and all loving, but he also values love in his creatures. And because he values love in his creatures, he's willing to allow evil for a specific period of time in order for love to truly exist between his creation and himself. And that's what we see also in our story. Remember, I talked to you about Jim Ladd. Well, he was one of 4 people on the USS Dorchester who were known as the 4 chaplains. There they are. And this was the story that night in 1943 when the torpedo hit the boat. It said the captain sailed outside the shipping lanes and had ordered the men to sleep in their clothing and keep their life jackets on. But because this was a ship really meant for 600 people that they crammed 900 soldiers on, it was way too hot. Everybody was packed in together, and they had all taken their life jackets off because they were sweating. They couldn't get to sleep, things like that. And others couldn't, felt that the life jacket wouldn't allow them to lay right. Anyway, once the ship was struck, panic ensued on board, as you can imagine. But the 4 U.S. chaplains sought to soothe the fears of the men. Lieutenant George Fox, Lieutenant Alexander Good, Lieutenant John P. Washington, and Lieutenant Clark Poling ultimately laid down their lives for the sake of their troops. One witness, Private William Bednar, found himself floating in the oil-smeared water surrounded by dead bodies and debris. And he said, I could hear men crying, pleading, and praying. But then he said, I could also hear the chaplains preaching courage. It was their voices that was the only thing that kept me going. The chaplains stayed on deck and began passing out life jackets to the men, found out that there were too few for all the passengers on board, so they passed out their own. And Grady Clark says, as I swam away from this ship, I looked back. The flares had finally lighted everything. The bow came up high, then she slid under. The last thing I saw was the 4 chaplains up there praying for the safety of the men. Those chaplains had done everything they could. I did not see them again. They themselves did not have a chance without their life jackets. And John Ladd specifically commented, it was the finest thing I'd ever seen or hoped to see this side of heaven. The chaplains locked arms, sang and prayed for the men as the Dorchester sank with them. So, in addressing the problem of evil, what we see is most evil really is an aspect of what I call moral evil, man's inhumanity to man. People go to war, try to kill one another. People become selfish and try to cheat one another. People cut each other off on the freeway, right? Man's inhumanity to man is legion. And that's part of the problem when we start talking about the problem of evil. Most evil that we complain about really has its basis in us not loving one another, not exercising that love that we are capable of. But because of our free choice, we turn away and tend to do something else. We tend to put ourselves above someone else. So is that God's fault or is that our fault? That's the question. I think before you start blaming God, we have to look inside ourselves. Or we can be like the 4 chaplains and set an example of selflessness. And notice the reaction that even without thinking that it was a great thing for the ship to sink, there was still good that came out of that. And it made an impression on these people for the rest of their lives. Many of these men, like John Ladd, would go on, remember it forever, probably change the character of who he was. So, God can come and show good through the times of evil. But what about those other aspects of evil? What about evil outside of man's control? So we've talked about moral evil now. What about natural evil? And this was a conversation I had with an individual, one of the professors of philosophy that I had in one of my classes. He said, quote, even if the moral evil question can be answered by the free will defense, the natural problem of evil is enough to prove that there is no God. Now, what is natural evil? Well, natural evil are these things that fall outside of our control. Earthquakes, tsunamis, plague, pestilence, right? Pandemics. All of those things that are part of the universe that really fall outside. Isn't God responsible for that? Is what he's asking. Well, we have to be careful in thinking this through. Sometimes what we think is natural evil is actually not. It might be a result of moral evil. For example, let's think about something like cancer. You start to see individuals with cancer, and you say, how could God allow cancer in my family to be so rampant, right? Why? I have 3 people in my family that are affected by cancer. It's terrible. It is terrible. That would be awful. But maybe that's not necessarily an aspect of natural evil. I mean, imagine that you're living on a land that gets its water from a well, and that well is dug in an area where 150 years ago, instead of properly disposing of the chemicals that they used to manufacture a product, companies were just dumping the chemicals out into the woods or something like that, and it leached into the water supply. Now, that happened before you were around, but the results of it, the ramifications of it, are being felt today. That's not necessarily natural evil. That's an outworking of moral evil. So we have to be careful when we, again, even in natural evil circumstances, we don't know what the problem is going to be. But sometimes God will use natural evil to serve his purposes. So, for example, the story in John chapter 9, where a man was born blind from birth, right? His disciples asked this question. Why did this individual become blind? Who sinned? This man or his parents? They asked. And what did Jesus say? He didn't say it was his fault, so he's getting punished, or his parents' fault. Jesus said this came about so that God's work might be displayed in him. The man's blindness had him seek out Jesus. And once he sought out Christ and was healed by him, he then brought others to Christ as well. And this is what Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians. The sufferings of this world can produce benefits in the next. 2 Corinthians says, therefore we do not lose heart, for our momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison, while we look not at the things which are seen, but which are the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. So sometimes God will use natural evil for his purposes. How do you learn compassion unless you have someone upon which to show compassion? How do you learn empathy? How do you learn grace? How do you learn selflessness? Right? Matter of fact, if you want to make a selfish child, if you want to spoil a child, it's an easy recipe to achieve. You just give them everything that they want. You never let them struggle. You never let them work through things in life. It's the struggles in life that build us up, not only in our character, but it builds us up in learning how to deal with defeat so that we can pick ourselves up and move forward. So there's that aspect of it. But that's not the only aspect of it, because we also have to remember that we come in a fallen world. Right? All creation has been corrupted since Adam. His sin, his original sin, impacts the rest of us for all of this world. And matter of fact, in Romans 8:22, it says all of creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. We know that the world is broken. And I think that's one part of this. It's important for us to understand that we can't solve it all ourselves. And I think people, when things are going really, really well, people get arrogant and they think they can. It's easy to dismiss the needs for security when you think that you've got it all figured out, when the crime rate is low, right? But all of a sudden, when things get bad, it's a different story. So one of the aspects of pain in this world is to point us toward God, just like the blind man who was needing to seek out Jesus. So all of creation has been corrupted by the sin of Adam. We need to remember that. And our own sin is undervalued. It's kind of like food. We tend to underestimate the number of calories we eat and overestimate the number of calories we burn. That happens all the time. But the heinousness of our sin, the debauchery that we actually exercise, the level of cruelty and misery we inflict upon one another, we don't realize it. We don't realize that we are all actually Auschwitz enabled, as my friend Clay Jones says, right? In his book, Why Does God Allow Evil? He goes to great lengths to document all of the various cultures and how it wasn't just the monsters in Nazi Germany that were turning into Jews. It was the everyday folks. We can, on the turn of a dime, become that if we think that's what's expected of us, if we think that's what the society is looking at us to do, and we can start to justify it in our own minds. It is easy for us to be cruelty. Psychologists have argued this for many years. There are many studies that Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, we have all of these different testimonies to show how everyday normal people can be cruel to one another, and it really doesn't take much for us to get there. So, evil acts as a restraining power in the world in some sense, because what it does is it keeps us humble from thinking that we can control it all, and it really underscores our sin. One good example of the way evil can act as a restraining power is when you have like sexually transmitted diseases. In the 1980s, AIDS began a really huge spread across the LGBTQ community. And many of their practices, their promiscuousness, the bathhouses that were in all of the major cities shut down pretty quickly because this was a deadly disease. Now, it wasn't because they wanted to be moral individuals that those things shut down. It was because there was a fear of catching the disease. And that's what I mean when I say sometimes certain natural evils can act as an inhibitor or as a restraining power. Even the Eastern cultures have this idea of karma, that even if you get away with it and no one sees, you'll get paid back, so you better not do it. So this karma comes out of the idea of suffering, and people say, I at least better act like I'm supposed to act because there is a threat of suffering and we can recognize it. Lastly, evil is allowed sometimes because there may be not necessarily God, but demonic activity that may be responsible for some of these issues that we see. Pointing back to Job chapter 1, this is clearly the case. God allowed the devil to tempt Job, but it was the devil and his forces that were causing these pains and causing these trials. David went through the same thing when the devil tempted him to number the people of Israel. So we can't necessarily rule out demonic activity as one of the instigators of natural evil, knowing that God will, again, come in and he can turn that into good and he can call you unto him. Okay, so here's the next question though. In all of this, and this is the key piece when we really start talking about this, because let's face it, every belief system has to deal with this question. This is not unique to Christianity that evil exists. All belief systems deal with the problem of evil. So where is God in these times of evil? If evil is in some way, shapes, inescapable, where is God in order to help us during those times? Well, number one, God is beside us in times of evil. We need to understand that suffering is part of the Christian life. God knows that, and he understands our suffering, and he cares about our situation. Jesus taught us in Luke chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents? Yet not one of them is forgotten before God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, you are more valuable than many sparrows. Psalm 34:18 reads, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And 1 Peter 5, verse 7 says, cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. See, God, in the person of Jesus, understands our suffering, right? He experienced our suffering in the cross. Jesus lived the life of us. And this is a unique aspect of Christianity. In no other faith do you have people and gods maybe sometimes doling out the suffering. The ancient Greek gods Zeus and Hera would get jealous at one another. And we're going to talk about more of those kinds of things next week when we deal with Jesus versus the supposedly pagan myths. And is Jesus just a copy of all these other dying and rising gods? We'll deal with that next week. But here, instead of just watching on people, get slammed on the sidelines or just thinking of them as collateral damage, Christianity teaches that God came down in the form of a human being and joined us so that he could experience sufferings with us. Philippians 3:10, Paul says, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. And realize, just because we don't understand why we suffer doesn't mean that suffering isn't there for a reason. In John chapter 9, Jesus said God allowed the affliction of the blind man so that the power of God could be revealed. It caused the man to believe in Jesus. It also had the man testify before the Pharisees so that others heard about Jesus as well. Maybe this is why James writes in the beginning of his book that we should consider it all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. There you go. The suffering that we face today will produce for us a stronger faith, a bolder love for God, a closer knit relationship with him in the coming days. Even Paul prayed 3 times for God to remove this physical infirmity that he had, this thing that hurt him, that caused him pain. He was given this thorn in the flesh. But he said, God told him, no, this is to keep you from exalting yourself. It is a restraint. It is an inhibitor so that you don't think too highly of yourself. And therefore, Paul says, I rejoice in it. Lastly, and one of the things that we do take joy in is the idea that God is working all things together for good to those who love him. Now, we all think about this in the story of Joseph, right? Joseph in the book of Genesis is a great example of this. Here is a gentleman, young man, sure, father's favorite, but really there's nothing that's said poorly on Joseph throughout the scripture. There's Joseph and Daniel are the 2 individuals where no sin is attributed to them directly in the pages of scripture. And he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was following his father's orders. He was getting these dreams. His brothers kind of despised him for it. They were jealous. They were selfish. They weren't necessarily worried about God's will or their father's will. They were worried about their position. And so what happens? They capture him, right? They were going to kill him. They decided not to do that. Sold him to some Ishmaelite trader. Sold him into slavery in Egypt. He becomes slave of Potiphar's house. And again, starts to get better. Potiphar's wife says, lie with me. He says, no, I won't do that. Does the right thing. Does things get better for Joseph because he does the right thing? No, they get worse, right? He gets thrown in the jail because she testifies falsely on his behalf. And he gets stuck there for 3 years. And here we see a story where it feels like Joseph is going down, down, down. First he was in his father's house, then he's in the pit, then he's sold to Potiphar, then he's thrown into the dungeon, right? Keeps getting down, down, down. But really, God is doing something different. Think about it in reverse. First, God gives Joseph a charge over his family's business. Then he grows that and he allows him to run the household of an important city official. Then he grows that and allows Joseph to run and organize an entire government prison system until Joseph is then ready during the famine to orchestrate and administer the food distribution for the entire world. God increased Joseph's responsibility and his availability to execute big projects through each of these circumstances. We think of it as getting worse, 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 but God gave him more and more responsibility in order that all could be saved, which is exactly what Joseph says. And here's the key in all of this. Christianity offers the solution to evil. And this is, I think, the thing that gives me the most confidence in the Christian faith. Of all faiths that I know, Christianity is the thing that solves the problem of evil. It doesn't just let it sit out there. In the Eastern faiths, like Buddhism, you have to deny the reality of evil. It's all an illusion. Or you have to become one with the world, evil and all. In the materialist faiths, in the idea of atheism and things like that, nature's just red in tooth and claw, and survival of the fittest, well, whoever wins, wins. Right? But Christianity says, no, that's not the way it should be. Consider the idea that God suffered for us, that Jesus' love caused him to suffer and die on the cross. Consider the fact that the Father, in giving of his Son, suffered as well. I mean, think about that. I know that in my experience, I would never want to have my children suffer instead of myself. I would always want to step in, but the Father allowed his Son. So here's the solution for evil. The sufferings of this present age, again, are not to be compared with the glories that are to come. Christ gives us the power to withstand our sufferings. right? Philippians 4:12 and 13 says, I know both how to make do with little and I know how to make do with a lot. Paul's saying I can live in either circumstance. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being content. Whether to be well-fed or hungry, whether in abundance or in need, I am able to do all things through him who strengthens me. I am able to do all things through him who strengthens me. Amen. And lastly, Christianity does give us someone to appeal to. Now, I read David in Psalm chapter 5, but I didn't complete it. Here's what David does after his lament, after the suffering, right? He prays this. He says, I enter your house, the abundance of your faithful love. I bow down toward your holy temple in reverential awe of you. Lord, lead me in your righteousness. See, David has the right response. He looks to God. Because of my adversaries, make your way straight before me. But let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them shout for joy forever. May you shelter them, and may those who love your name boast about you. For you, Lord, bless the righteous one. You surround him with favor like a shield. And there we have David showing the proper response to evil. And I think that's right. Now, one other thing. I did tell you the story about my son, who, again, when my wife was having that third touch, he was in crisis. And I was praying. I was saying, Lord, I don't know what you're doing. But I knew I couldn't doubt that God was there. Now, he was born. He spent 2 weeks in an NICU unit. Like I said, he was just a little guy. My wife was in ICU for a week, and he was in NICU for 2. But he has since grown up to be a wonderful musician, a wonderful man. He's playing in churches now, and he does a great job and serves God in all of those ways. So, yes, while there can be difficulty in life, know that God can make the end come out great from the beginning. Okay, so that's our class. Now, we do have time for questions. If you're on YouTube, please feel free to log in. Looks like we do have a couple of questions now. I have a couple of questions. First one here says from Rita, thanks for the course. We're told to rejoice. Ephesians 4:4, 1 Thessalonians 5:16. What are some practical steps to take to rejoice in the response of suffering and evil? That's a great question, Rita. And I think one of the ways that you can do this is really kind of to take a page out of David's book. What the psalmists usually do, and many psalms are structured this way, where you have kind of the first half of the psalm saying, you know, they're looking inward. What am I going to do about this? And it's natural for us to stay up at night, worry about our problems, because your mind just goes back to it, thinks about it over and over and over again. And how do we deal with it? But when the psalmist turns towards you, when they start thinking about who God is, how faithful he's been in the past, what has he done for me all these years that I've walked with him and known him, all of a sudden you start thinking about God's attributes, God's character. He who did not spare his own son but gave him up for his all, it says in Romans chapter 8, would he not also with him freely give us all things? So we see this idea that God in his character would always bring us through these trials in that aspect, in one way or the other, whatever his will is. Moses did this whenever he was, worried about the people. It says, this is your character. This is who you are. Again, David does this in the Psalm. We reflect upon who God is, how he lives. Another question we have here, would you agree, that suffering is a needed prerequisite for the development of virtues in people, and why? Yes, I completely agree that is true. I think that suffering is a prerequisite because I think we become too enamored with ourselves. We tend to believe more about ourselves than we should. We tend to trust ourselves more than is warranted. And we tend to downplay, again, our evil acts, our evil inclinations more than we should as well. So, yes, I think that not only that, and I mentioned this before in the talk, in order to hone selflessness, how do you hone selflessness unless you can shun those things? You can't be brave unless you're facing danger. Bravery doesn't work without facing danger, right? Makes sense. You can't show mercy upon someone if there's no mercy to be shown. How can you grow that aspect of your character? All of those things kind of play into effect in this regard. So, yes, I think we can. I think we need to grow in those aspects of who we are and what we do. And I think they become important as individuals. And again, it's just like teaching a child. Sometimes when you have a young boy or girl and you want to teach them how to help around the house, you don't do it for them. You have them do it. You know that they're going to struggle a little. You may be holding the bag when they're trying to carry the groceries in, or guiding the broom behind them, but you have to let them struggle with it a little bit, because that's how we learn. That's how we understand these things. And I think those kinds of issues will really make a big difference in people's lives. So yes, I believe that that's true. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for all of these great comments and questions. I appreciate it. I think this has been great. Next week, and I don't have an image for it, unfortunately, will be our last Christianity in the Hot Seat episode, where we're going to talk about Jesus. Is Christianity just a copycat faith? Is Jesus just a copycat of other religions? We'll talk about the movie, the Zeitgeist YouTube video that was popular, as well as other things. So make sure that you tune in. It's next Sunday. That'll be our last one. But I've really had a good time engaging with you guys. Make sure that you go to the comereason.org website. And if you haven't put your email down for the class, if you go to comereason.org/dare to defend, make sure you sign up for that, because we're going to be releasing all of these classes as a bundle there, as well as certain notes in my PowerPoint slides, and all that stuff will be available for you there. So until then, I hope you have a great week, and God bless.